Brace yourself. Get it passed up anytime now. Collect yourself. Things will never be the same in that sad world. Around a lot a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So sit back in your hole.
All right, so good morning again, everybody. Good to be with you today. Want to do two things with you over the next couple of minutes, next few minutes. One, I want to say a couple of last observations connected to our discussion on the role of privilege in society, both racial privilege and other sources of privilege. That was the previous conversation we have. And then I want to introduce something that's been a really important concept in ethical thought in the West for at least the last 800 years. It's something that's relevant to the Module 7 topic of immigration, and it's something that surprisingly popped up in news headlines about a month ago. It's not very often you hear people on the news and contemporary politicians talking about concepts that come from Thomas Aquinas with Latin names, but it is a concept that will be helpful for us in our thinking through the very complex issue of immigration. But first, just a little more on our conversation about privilege. If you missed that, be sure you watch the video from our previous conversation. One of the sources of privilege we talked about in the last conversation, where the goal of the last conversation was to illustrate that while racial privilege is a real causal factor in society, that the overall notion of privilege is much, much, much more complex than this, that there are many, many, many sources of privilege, and it doesn't quite seem sensible to treat privilege as morally charged, as if, for instance, health is a source of privilege. If you are born without brain cancer, you have an unearned advantage over the person that is born with brain cancer. And it doesn't seem very sensible to say that the person born without brain cancer bears some sort of moral responsibility for the lack of opportunities provided to the person who's born with brain cancer. That there is a role for fortune in this. For the ancient Greeks spoke about the fates weaving destiny. There's a role for luck in life, and sometimes when one enters life with fewer cards to play than another, even when that is driven by past injustices, that for one to focus on one's lack of privilege and for one to cultivate a sense of victimhood, here I'm not making a moral judgment, just a practical judgment, that to cultivate a sense of victimhood is rarely helpful. I'm making no statement on whether it's good or bad to have a sense of victimhood related to a lack of privilege, but that it's rarely helpful. That in the metaphor of the foot race that we used to discuss this in yesterday's or in the last conversation, that the unfair reality is that if I've been given a starting place in the race further back than others, that ruminating, that focusing on my unfair placement gets me no closer to the finish line. The only thing that does get me closer to the finish line is running faster. A couple last thoughts along those lines. One of the sources of privileges that we highlighted were what I called cultural virtues and vices. And again, this is important not to mishear what's being claimed here. It is not being claimed that certain cultures are better than other cultures. That's a very problematic claim, and that's often a claim that's driven by racism, and it's not the claim I'm making. I explicitly reject the notion that some cultures are better than others. But because cultures are different from one another, it does mean that different cultures have different strengths and different weaknesses, from which it follows that some cultures are better at some things than others. And that's a major contributing factor to the difference in outcome that people experience in their lives, especially when it comes to academic performance and economic performance, right? There is a real inequity of outcome in our society that can be predicted statistically when you look at things like race and ethnicity and so forth. And that assuming we reject a racist explanation for that people of some races underperform statistically, underperform academically or economically because they are inferior, because some races are better than others, assuming that with me you all reject that explanation, then the difference in outcome is still crying out to the heavens for an explanation. And a large portion of that explanation, I think, can be found in what I'm calling the privilege that relates to cultural virtues and cultural vices. Acknowledging that any individual can accomplish anything, right? That privilege is not about guaranteed outcomes, but likely outcomes, right? If we look in the United States of America, we've had a black president already. We've had two female major party nominees for the presidency, one of whom was a black female. It's despite the fact that women are still less privileged than men statistically when it comes to major roles of leadership in society, and that people of African descent are still less privileged than people of European descent when it comes to positions of leadership in society. We have seen that any individual, regardless of these, the combination of identity markers that speak to privilege, is capable of achieving anything as an individual. Still, statistically, these predictors of privilege and lack of privilege still hold up. One would find, I believe, when one examines the evidence, that people who are part of, you might want to say, racial groups, ethnic groups, national backgrounds that tend to underperform economically and especially academically, I think you will find that quite often they are parts of cultural groups that simply put less emphasis on study and academics and therefore study less. And sometimes when that is pointed out, there's an accusation of bias or racism raised against the person pointing that out. It strikes me that it's the alternative that's actually more racist. The alternative would seem to hold that there is something intrinsic to what it is to be, for instance, a black person in the United States, such that that person is less capable of academic success. In other words, black people can't read books. That strikes me as far more racist than saying, let's look at the patterns within different cultural groups and ethnic groups and see who spends more time studying. And the result is going to be, almost every case, statistically speaking, the groups that the social, economic, culture groups that tend to dominate in academia are the ones that study more. Which brings in, I think I've raised this before, but my favorite datum, that's the singular of data, my favorite datum in this topic is the fact that the highest performing group in the United States academically is Nigerians. Nigerian immigrants and second-generation Nigerian immigrants outperform everybody else, East Asians and Jewish people included. That's my favorite datum because it cuts against both the racists and the ones who want to explain everything as a result of the inevitable trickle-down effect of past injustices. There's an upside to the role that cultural virtues and vices, cultural strengths and weaknesses play in privilege, is that anybody can look critically at the things that his or her culture is weaker on rather than stronger on and say, but I'm an individual person and I'm going to rise above whatever the less helpful habits of my upbringing have been. Okay, we'll pause the privilege conversation there and move on to I want to talk for a few minutes about a really important ethical concept that especially for the last 800 years has been central to the Western ethical tradition and our moral reasoning, and can be particularly helpful in trying to make sense of the complex issue of immigration. It's a Latin term, the Ordo Amoris. I guess the is not Latin. Ordo Amoris. It translates to the order of charity. And I'll illustrate it before I explain it. All right, so, let's say you have two families that live next door to each other. And in each household, there are children. All right? So, if a man finds out that his next door neighbor's children are starving, is it good for him to share his food with his next door neighbor? I'm getting people nodding their heads in the general direction of the microphone. Okay. One might even argue, particularly if this is a person with excess, that there is some moral obligation to share food with the neighbor. Dexter would not be one of those. I didn't expect you to argue. But can you see how one can make a non-absurd argument that if I have extra and my neighbor's kids are starving, that I have an obligation to share of my extra? However, if my kids are also starving and I only have enough food to feed my kids, do I have a moral obligation to take the food out of my children's mouth to feed the children of my next door neighbor? In this let's just accept it. In this illustration, both sets of children are starving. Do I have an obligation to take food from my starving children to feed someone else's starving children? People are shaking their heads no, and Dolly mouthed no while she also shook her head. See, the Ordo Amoris, a term that comes to us from the Middle Ages, and Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively about this, so I don't believe he coined the term, holds that I have a moral obligation to everybody, right? That moral obligation ought to be driven by charity, and charity here is especially in the medieval Christian tradition. Charity is the highest of the virtues, and it doesn't just mean like helping the poor. It's a translation of the Greek term agape, which is the highest form of love. It's self-giving love. That I have a moral obligation, is particularly from a virtue ethics perspective, where what I want to do is become the best version of me possible. I do that by giving of myself because I will the good of the other. And I have that obligation to every person on earth. But the extent of my obligation to every person on earth is not equal. Right? There is an order to the demands of charity. I have the strongest obligation to take care of the needs of my family. In traditional Western political theory, coming from Aristotle, we talked about this. The family is the fundamental unit of society, right? And I have the strongest obligation to care for my family. which is why, though it's very good for me to help the starving children next door, it is not good to take the very food out of my children's mouths to do it. I have a primary obligation to care for my family. And then the obligation I have decreases as the circle of people becomes further removed from my family, right? So I have the greatest obligation to my family, and then I have a greater obligation to my local community than I do to the world as a whole, right? And then I have greater obligations, we might say, to voluntary communities. Think of your group of close friends at school versus the other people at school that you're not close friends with versus people at another school. If, God forbid, there were a school bus accident, right, and you heard that students your age at Davenport High School had been killed in a school bus accident, you would be upset. It seems to me that you would be more upset if they were Four Corners Upper School students killed in a school bus accident, even if they weren't your personal friends. That would hit home more. And you'd be more upset still, God forbid, if they were your friends, right? And not that our emotional attachment is always a surefire indicator of good and evil. Nevertheless, you'd probably recognize that when it comes to our obligations to help people, right, you would feel more obligated to share your lunch with a close friend who forgot her lunch than you would with a rando. That's what the kids these days are calling them, right? Randos, with a random student that you don't know. But would probably feel more obligated to share your lunch with a random Four Corners student than if you just heard, hey, somebody at Davenport High School forgot their lunch. I don't think any of you are going to run in the car and drive down there, right? Let's draw the circle wider, right? You would have a greater obligation to tend to the needs of the people in your own nation than you would people outside of your own nation. It is good, for example, we live in an incredibly wealthy nation, right? And it is good for a wealthy nation to assist less wealthy nations with economic aid, right? It is good for the United States to send help and money to poorer nations, especially in times of emergency. Yet it would not be good for the United States to neglect her own poor citizens in order to tend to the needs of people outside of the country. Notice that the moral obligation we have to people, the obligation never reaches zero, okay? But practically, our ability to help might reach zero. Statistically, the odds are not bad that right now in China there's a child drowning. There's a lot of people in China and children drown. Right now, this minute, there's a good chance that there's a child in China drowning. What is my moral obligation to that child? Dexter's given a thumbs down, so he's saying I have no moral obligation to that child. Okay. If you didn't hear Dexter, he said, I have no control over the situation. I'm in Davenport, Florida. I can't get to China in the time it takes to drown. Okay, saying, I've got no control over the situation, therefore I have no moral obligation. I'm going to answer it differently than Dexter did. The outcome's going to be the same, right? But the principle's going to be a little different, right? See how this sounds to you. You don't have to agree, but here's how I look at it. Matter of fact, I have a moral obligation to do everything in my power to save the life of the child who's drowning in China right now. It just so happens that there is nothing in my power I can do. It's not that the drowning Chinese child has like gotten so far out of my circles according to the order of charity that I have no obligations, that I have no moral connection, that we might as well not exist at the same time. It's just a simple practical matter that there's nothing I can do to save that child's life, right? The notion of Ordo Amoris, again, it's a centuries-old concept. People started talking about it who don't. What am I caught on? People started talking about it about a month and a half ago who don't normally talk about Latin medieval scholastic ethical concepts, because Vice President J.D. Vance made reference to the Ordo Amoris in a television interview as part of his defense of his administration's current crackdown on illegal immigration. I was very happy to hear that he made reference to the principle and brought the principle into the conversation. It probably is the most relevant ethical principle to the debate. That's a far cry from me saying that I think he drew the appropriate conclusions from the principle. It's not my place as a professor to make that analysis. It's not readily obvious. It would need to be. He would really need to demonstrate the case. But as far as the principle itself being relevant, I think the principle is incredibly relevant. Because we are a wealthy nation, right? And it is good for a wealthy nation to open its doors to underprivileged people from outside of the country, right? That's 4-year-old ethics. You teach a 4-year-old, share your toys, right? At the same time, there are 8 billion people in the world. We can't support them all. So we need to make some sort of determinations of under what circumstances do we welcome people from outside of the country into the country. And I will admit I'm not taking a particular political stance here, but I'll say I'm willing to say more about this than I would in my high school courses. And my thoughts on this topic are heavily influenced by the last 7 years that I've spent teaching a largely immigrant student population, that I very much tend to lead toward as much openness as possible on the topic. The particulars of what immigration policy should be in place, what restrictions should be in place, are for the most part matters of prudential judgment, right? That require not a determination of what is good and what is evil. To be generous when you have excess is good. To be stingy when you have excess is evil. But to determine how and when to do the good. I worry that an immigration policy that is too restrictive, and notice I'm not taking a stance on what the particulars of what that is, simply acknowledging that there can be immigration policies that are too restrictive. Those types of policies strike me as misusing the Ordo Amoris, right? It's one thing for me to say that I'm not going to share my starving children's food with my neighbor's starving children. But I worry that some of the super restrictive immigration policies are more like me saying, I'm not going to use my children's Nintendo money to feed my neighbor's starving children. And that starts to become quite ethically questionable from my perspective. As you read through, and think through, and write through, if you take certain of the options for the Module 7 reflection, as you work through thinking ethically about the topic of immigration, I think the Ordo Amoris model will be very helpful. And the driving questions need to be: when is it acceptable? When is it acceptable to be restrictive in our charity, in our generosity? And it would seem to me that to justify a more restrictive immigration policy, it would seem to me necessary to demonstrate that the restrictive policy is essential for the good of the people of this nation, the legitimate good of the people of this nation. So let's give some examples that ought not to be controversial. Screening out, when possible, terrorists and actual members of drug cartels. That seems it ought to be uncontroversial, that to be restrictive in that sense is necessary for the benefit of the people of this country, to whom we have a greater moral obligation. I think you'll find that's a shockingly small portion of the number of people whose immigration status is in question. Another question to consider, then we'll be done for today. Another question to consider, and I think I do ask about this in one of the reflection options, is it has also been traditionally held in the West that an immigrant has a certain moral responsibility to, I won't use the term assimilate, but to integrate respectfully into the host culture. And are there times when, for cultural and ideological and political reasons, certain populations are less able to do that? This, I think, in fairness, is an argument that's raised illegitimately when it comes to most immigration from this hemisphere. I think there is very little about any culture on this side of the world, or Latin American culture, or Haitian culture, that cannot meaningfully integrate into the dominant host culture in the United States of America. But there are other cultures where some of the defining values of our civilization are rejected out of hand. And there are places in the world where nothing near a majority, but a non-negligible, non-zero percentage of the population would very much like to immigrate to the West, to partake of the economic benefits that come from immigration to the West, and would also very much like to destroy the West and transform it into something different. There are people right now, for ideological reasons, for pathological reasons, for reasons of religious extremism, who the only reason they are not killing you and me right this second is that they can't reach us. And that's a not insignificant question to raise in the immigration debate in light of the Ordo Amoris. What are my obligations to the people of my own nation when it comes to opening the doors to people from cultures where significant minorities would dance in the street in celebration if someone were to blow me up? And as uncomfortable as questions like that are, there is no conceivable benefit to not asking them, as uncomfortable as they are. And it is not racist or xenophobic to not want to be murdered. The last time a person with my exact job, a teacher of literature and ethics in a high school to honors high school students in the West, this was in Paris, was beheaded by a radical Islamist student, has yet to reach the double digit of years. I would love for that to not happen to me. And I don't think that makes me particularly xenophobic. Did I just advocate we don't allow Muslims into the country? Of course not. I love every Muslim person I've ever worked with. I love my Muslim students. I think we're all better off for them being here. At the same time, we either ask the hard questions or people get their heads cut off. There's no middle ground. I'm not proposing an answer to the question, but in this, a college ethics course where the assignment is to think through these topics, I would be gravely negligent if I hadn't raised the question. Okay. Any concluding thoughts, arguments? You want to throw something at me? Or shall we call it a day? No, kind of a heavy topic, huh? Okay. That's all I need from you for today. Rest of the time is yours.
A bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So slip back in your hole, or get back in your cave. If I'm going down, I'm taking someone with me.